Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to today's webinar. A warm welcome to all of my centres and any of Muno's centres that might be joining us today. While I'm doing this webinar, obviously I'm sharing my PowerPoint with you. So if you are saying anything in the chat, it's possible that I wouldn't be aware of that. I'll try and keep an eye on the chat to see whether anybody is trying to ask any questions. But really, I think we'll be dealing with the questions at the end of the session. As always, I will share the PowerPoint with you. And as always, I will also share with you the link so that you can access the recording afterwards, so you can pass it on to other people or just review the material. So it's about just after 9:30 UK time, so I'm going to get started. Okay, so today's session is about maladministration, and these are the topics that we will be covering. So we're going to be talking about what maladministration is, so defining it, looking at the scope of it. We'll look at some of the common cases that we have come across, the consequences of maladministration. We'll look at ways to avoid maladministration. Then we'll look at duties and obligations from the point of view of the centre, but also from us at NCC Education. And finally, we'll finish with the centre maladministration process and sanctions. So firstly, let's define maladministration. So it is any activity that results in mistakes or poor process, neglect, default, or other practice that results in the centre or the candidate not complying with the specified requirements for delivery of the qualification. So you can see it's a very wide range encompassing so many different things that could come under that definition. So what I'm going to try to do now is give you the scope so you have a little bit more of an idea of some of the areas that this touches on. So in terms of the scope, like I said, it's very wide, but some of the areas it includes are, so if we look at the assessment process, first of all, so it could be that somehow you or the student have deviated from our assessment procedure, or you've not followed it correctly. Could be mishandling exam papers, failing to follow guidelines, or compromising the security of the assessment materials. Other examples might be things like not getting the students to sign the attendance register. That would be another example that falls into that category. Not including a seating plan when you're submitting all the documents for the exams. Then record keeping, and this really is crucial when we think about the fact that these are really high stake assessments for students. You know, it's determining what they're going to be able to do when they've completed. So it's so important that we accurately record information regarding these students. So whether that is to do with discrepancy in the learner achievement or attendance records or assessment outcomes. I'll give you some recent examples that I have come across. So an example would be when the total marks on the exam script, let's say it's a local exam that's being marked by you as a centre, and you've marked it and you've added up the marks. And when we are now looking at that sample, the total of the marks that we get is different to the mark that's actually on the front of the student exam as their final mark. It could be something like the mark that has been inputted on quarts for the student doesn't correlate with the mark that's on the student's assignment or on their script. So these are the kind of things that I mean when I'm talking about record keeping. They're just examples of what it could mean. And then we have confidentiality breaches. So if any confidential or sensitive material is shared with students or with anybody really without the proper authorization. Other areas that come into it within the scope of it would be failure to abide by the published deadlines in our activity schedules. So we could be talking about late submission of any results or samples, etc. Failure to correctly follow other assessment-related processes. Now, I know that you may feel there's a kind of crossover with the earlier point, but it could be, for example, we don't get the Turnitin reports, or we don't get all of the Turnitin reports we're expecting, or something is submitted in the wrong format. For example, the audio is in a format that can't be opened. So things like that. And then the last point on there for the scope is poor communication. So, I mean, that is also very broad scope. It could be poor communication in the lead up to the deadline for submission. So maybe not asking for that support in a timely manner, asking for it on the day of the deadline, maybe. That would be an example of poor communication, or lack of or slow action when we are contacting you about any issues with your submissions. That could also come under poor communication. So hopefully that's helped you see that it encompasses so many different things, and some of the things may seem very small, they seem very minor, but could have quite significant consequences for a student, which we'll look at some of the consequences a little later. So now let's have a look at common cases of maladministration. So this, we have looked at our most recent few cycles to see what are the most common things that are happening when it comes to maladministration. And these are kind of the top 4 that we have analysed. So the first one is non-submission. So something isn't submitted, whether that's attendance, whether that's marks, the marker name, or the moderation sample. And not submitted by the deadline. The next one is incorrect submission. So where things have been submitted, somehow it's not been done correctly. So for example, we've got attendance, marks, marker names, and moderation sample. Then we've got incomplete submission. So we received part of what we were expecting, but perhaps we expected to have 6 samples, but you've only sent us 5 samples. Perhaps you've not sent us any of the Turnitin reports, or maybe you've sent not the correct number of Turnitin reports. Missing examination scripts, so we've received some students' exams, but not the others, or maybe we've received none of a particular component. So that's another issue. And then the last of the kind of common cases is to do with the word count. So recently we sent you all an announcement to explain that, to clarify the situation with the word count, that when a word count is given, the mark scheme will state that you're supposed to not mark once the student has reached that limit of whatever that word count is. You're supposed to make clear that this is the point that you stopped marking, and none of the work that appears after that limit is marked by the marker. But unfortunately, we're receiving some students' work where it's not been made clear where the marking has stopped, and in fact sometimes the marking has continued right until the end of the assignment with no kind of penalty and no stopping where you're supposed to have stopped. So those are the top 4 kind of issues that we've been dealing with in the most recent cycles. So in terms of the consequences, when a centre commits maladministration, it can have some quite serious consequences. So, for example, NCC's education's reputation could become tarnished. And in this happening, students and teachers and regulators would also lose faith in the qualification itself. We could have negative publicity. There have been instances when students or parents might take to social media to vent their frustration if results haven't been released, or they've been delayed due to some kind of maladministration that's happened at the centre. And you can see how that doesn't only impact NCC education, it has an impact on you as a centre and wider public view of the qualification. Also, when we're dealing with the maladministration, it actually may incur additional costs to NCC education to monitor and to audit and to ensure the compliance. We also have to increase our manpower so that we can actually do the auditing and the chasing and the following up and the amending when we have discovered what's supposed to be have done correctly. We then may have to go in and amend parts of the submission. Also, if there is reputational damage, it might lead to a decrease in student numbers. And depending on the nature of the maladministration that we're talking about, there might even be legal costs involved. So where it does seem like, these are only minor issues, there are much wider consequences when it comes to maladministration. Ultimately, as educators, our concern is for students. So we need to keep in mind the student, and maladministration can impact the student. If our NCC education qualification quality standards are compromised, it will actually devalue the status and the quality of the education if we are seen to have lax standards. So that's why it's so important that it's enforced and that centres comply. Those students might decide that they're going to study elsewhere or with another awarding body. Also, as a regulated qualification, we need to be mindful that if the maladministration is high from centres, that we may actually come under intense scrutiny from regulators, and we may even be sanctioned or placed under restrictions. And all of this will have a wider impact on centres and ultimately on students as well. So in terms of ways to avoid maladministration, we've come up with some suggestions of how we think it can be avoided. So firstly, we always produce guides for all of our processes, and these guides go step by step through exactly the process that needs to be followed when you're doing your submissions. Along with these guides, we've also produced some webinars, which we've shared with you. Again, you can use the guides alongside the webinars to understand what the processes and regulations are around submissions. And of course, if you're unsure about any of this, then please do reach out to your ASM or your CSE in a timely manner, maybe a week or two before the deadline, so that we're able to put that support and help you to make sure that you're not going to find any issues when you're coming to do your submissions. The second way is to set a relevant internal deadline for students' assignment submission to ensure that you have ample time for preparation of submission to court's web portal. So obviously on our activity schedule, we publish the deadline. The deadline doesn't mean that that is the day that it's supposed to be submitted. The deadline means that this is when we are going to close it so that we can now start auditing and making sure that we have everything we need. Therefore, your deadline, obviously for students handing in those assignments, needs to be significantly before that, so that you have time to do all of the marking and all the processes and be able to submit at a time when you're not under pressure and can get the support that you need if required. Obviously, you'd also need to bear in mind if it's the first time that you are going to be doing this process, perhaps you're new in the role. Also, if it's a particularly larger cohort than what you're used to, or maybe if you're doing more assessments in a particular cycle than you're used to. So you'd need to bear that all in mind when you're setting your internal deadlines as well. Thirdly, conduct internal checks on the submission documents prior to submission deadline. I mean, just, very simple checklist. We have provided these in the past. You can create your own to make sure that all the documents are there that are required. And on the court's web itself, there is a checklist at different stages to say, have you done this? Have you included this? Have you remembered this particular format, etc. And in terms of those internal checks, these could or perhaps should include also checking that the marks have been calculated and inputted correctly as well, that the person who is supposed to be present is present, that anybody that was absent, that's clearly done. So just having a process and the time in place to do those internal checks. Make sure that the centre markers are well versed on the marking requirements and processes. So examples of this would be things like what I said about the word count, making sure that if we've given that announcement to maybe the center administrator, that is trickled down to the relevant marker, that they know when it comes to the word count, what the requirements are. Or even the fact that when marks are given, we expect there to be justifications included as to why the student has got these particular marks. And we do find quite often that work is marked, but the justifications haven't been included. So it's just communicating that to the marker so that we're not having to ask for that later. And lastly, communicate effectively with the ASM and CSE if there is any support required prior to submission deadline. So we're here to help, we're here to support you, but we can only do that if we're given the time to be able to do that with you. So please do bear in mind that if you're leaving it until the actual deadline day or very close to the deadline day, there's some chance that the person that you're contacting may be out of the office on that particular day. It then gets pushed to somebody else, and it all starts to take longer before your email is actually seen and a meeting is put into place to support you. Please also bear in mind the UK office hours. So we are Monday to Friday, 8:30 to 5 p.m. And I know that in some regions, your center may be open on a Saturday or maybe even on a Sunday. But if you're attempting to do your submissions on the Saturday and the deadline is Monday, it in effect is the same as doing it on the Monday, is that no one's actually going to see that email until Monday morning UK time. So please do bear that in mind as well when you're doing your deadline, when you're actually submitting, that maybe you should be doing that on the Thursday or the Friday, so that if you encounter any problems, we can give you that support at that point. So in terms of duties and obligations, you as a centre, you have a duty to report any suspected maladministration to NCC Education. You also have a duty to assist us in our investigations by providing any requested information, and actually not cooperating with an investigation could result in penalties being imposed on you as a centre. Furthermore, if you're not disclosing suspected maladministration to us, then that actually constitutes malpractice. And we would also expect you to make clear in your policies to your students that they should also be reporting any suspected maladministration to us, and that they can do that in confidence. So in terms of the duties and obligations of NCC Education, for us, our duties are and obligations are that we, for all maladministration allegations, we will investigate and or oversee the investigation. We'll ensure that our monitoring and auditing detects the maladministration early and addresses it early. We will always put training and support in place to make sure that the processes are fully understood and that they are followed. And we will develop our policies and processes so that they're clear and to ensure swift and effective resolution to maladministration as well. We'll also always communicate openly and transparently with everyone involved. And please bear in mind that there are times when we will actually need to report the maladministration to our regulators and other awarding bodies as well. So given all the consequences that I've mentioned, obviously we need to make sure that we at NCC Education and you as a centre are all working proactively to avoid maladministration, to ensure that we have those quality standards for our qualifications. So I'm now going to go through our centre kind of maladministration process and sanction process. These come into effect when there have been 3 or more cases of maladministration in one cycle from a centre. So if you as a centre in a cycle have 3 or more cases of maladministration, you will be contacted by us. And depending on if there's already been a sanction before, that will determine the severity of the sanction when you are now contacted by us. I'm going to go through the sanctions now. So sanction 1, that's the first time that you have 3 or more cases of maladministration committed in one cycle. And what happens at this point is that you will get a written warning from NCC Education that will explain what the maladministration is and what's happened. And at that point, you will now be closely monitored in the subsequent cycles to check for maladministration. That will happen for an academic year. This monitoring will be overseen by your academic standards manager. So you're likely to have a meeting shortly after you've had the letter and, have any kind of support put in place that you need. And obviously your academic standards manager might contact you shortly before each cycle to see again what support's needed and help you through that process so that hopefully there isn't a repeat. So that's sanction 1. Sanction 2, this happens when in a further cycle within any academic year, you now commit another 3 or more cases of maladministration. So let's say that the first sanction happened in spring 2024. You had your written formal warning letter, and it said, you've had 3 or more cases. And then let's say nothing happens in the summer, everything's fine, but now in the autumn cycle, you again have a situation where there's 3 or more cases of maladministration. So that triggers sanction 2. And sanction 2 is you will again have a written warning from NCC Education explaining exactly what the maladministration cases were. You will be placed on stop for future cycles. So depending on where you are in the cycle, that has different effects. It could affect things like results release. It could affect your ability to register students. So that on stop is only there until the point when all of your centre staff have had the mandatory training session with your academic standards manager. Once that training is done, the on-stop status can be removed. There will also be an action plan put into place. So the action plan will have specific actions for you as a centre and dates that those actions need to be completed by. And that action plan will be monitored by your academic standards manager. And again, the subsequent cycles will be monitored as well. You'll be monitored for an academic year. All of this will be recorded and addressed in your annual monitoring visit. So when you have your annual monitoring visit, there will be a note on there about the sanction 1 and the sanction 2, and it will form part of the discussions that you have will be around maladministration and how hopefully things have improved since the sanctions and the action plan were put into place. And then, further actions may come out of that as well. So sanction 3 means that you've had a sanction 1, you've had a sanction 2, but still within that year, you have now had another cycle in which you've had 3 or more cases of maladministration. So when that happens, again, the centre will be placed on stop, and this time there will be a formal maladministration investigation, and that will be overseen by the head of academics training and development. Depending on how that goes and the review of the action plan and whether the actions have been followed and whether there's been persistent maladministration, there is a chance that it could lead to disaccreditation of the centre. And then there's also a financial penalty of £200 to the centre if you reach the stage where you get a sanction 3. The other thing that goes along with this is that regardless of when your annual monitoring visit was due, when a sanction 3 is triggered, it's very likely that you will then have an on-site visit from at least your academic standards manager, but possibly the head of academics training and development as well. And you would, that visit, the cost of that visit would be for the centre to bear the cost of that, because that visit is there to put the necessary training and support in place to make sure that, things are fixed and there's no further issues to maladministration. Okay, so I'm now going to summarize the three kind of phases, if you like, of the sanctions that I've just outlined. So each of the sanction has an increased level of support and an increased penalty for the centre. So for sanction 1, it's mainly support. Yes, you do have this warning letter. Yes, you are being monitored for a year, but even that monitoring is being done to support you as a centre. And yeah, it's led by your academic standards manager, and it's monitored in your annual monitoring visit. It will be addressed and discussed at that point as well. With sanction 2, you've got the support again in the case of having that mandatory training session with your academic standards manager, but you're also on stop until that training happens. The action plan as well is a form of support, making sure that, you know, we've got a clear plan of action of how things will improve. And again, this is monitored by your academic standards manager and addressed during your annual monitoring visit. In sanction 3, yes, you've got the support of an action plan, but also put on stop, as in sanction 2. There's also a financial penalty this time, and the fact that there's a formal investigation led by the head of academics training and development, and there's that risk to the accreditation status as well. And then there's the fact that you may have some interim visits, so not just your normal annual monitoring, you might have some other visits in between to address and deal with the issues, which will be at the cost of the centre. So, having said all that, there is kind of an expectation from NCC Education that you as a centre will produce and maintain your own internal policies. These policies are there to kind of identify maladministration. But as well as that, you should have written procedures for how you will report and investigate incidents internally. So when the academic standards manager comes to your centre, that is one of the documents. Those are one of the the documents that the centre, that the ASM may ask to see. They would like to see what are your policies about identifying maladministration and what procedures do you have when it comes to reporting and investigating it. So it's important that you develop those so that we are able to monitor that during the annual monitoring. So as you can see, with this kind of expectation, it means that the approach that we're taking is that we require you as a centre to be proactive and to think about how you will manage maladministration, how you will deal with potential maladministration, no matter if it's perceived as being quite a minor kind of human error mistake, but what will you do when these things come up, that you've thought about it and you've got a plan in place. It requires you as a centre to be reflective post-assessment cycle. So not just reflecting on academic performance, but also reflecting on the maladministration side as well, and how that has gone. Also, it requires you as a centre to be accountable to maladministration when it comes to your annual monitoring visits, because you need to be able to answer what did you put in place to prevent maladministration? That's your policies and your procedures. You need to be able to answer, how did you deal with maladministration when it occurred, if it occurred? And how does that align with those policies and procedures that you've put in place? Whatever it is that you've done to deal with it, you need to answer, how did that reduce the instances of maladministration? And if it didn't, what is your next step to mitigate the risk? So very much as how we are as educators, as teachers, we are constantly reflecting on, how students are doing and what we might need to change and tweak and do differently. I guess we're asking you as a centre to also have some responsibility with that, with the maladministration, and to be reflective on how things can be done differently. And in terms of developing those policies and procedures, you're not being left on your own to do that. If you need any help at all with that, then please do reach out to your academic standards manager or your customer support executive, and we are more than happy to work with you to develop those policies together. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. So I will now stop sharing my screen so that I can see if there are any questions that have come in the chat. Any questions or comments on the maladministration presentation? Okay, nothing so far. If it's a case of you want to take this away and digest it and discuss with your team and come back maybe with any questions or comments, then please reach out to me or your CSE to give any kind of feedback or any questions or concerns, and we are more than happy to take that up with you. So since there are no questions, I think all that's left for me to say is thank you very much for attending. I will send you the slides and the recording, and I hope to be speaking to you all soon in due course. Enjoy the rest of your week and your day.